And we should be live. Okay. Welcome, everyone. I'm sorry that we have to do this again. I hope that you guys are home. Just a sec. Come on, mute. Oh, there we go. Sorry, I was hearing myself on the other screen. Not good. Um, I hope you guys are home today, and I hope that you guys are safe. You did not try to go to campus today. My class in particular is not worth it. So stay home, stay warm, get your coffee or your tea if you're, like that, British. Um, Today we're going to be talking about the Industrial Revolution. And it's a shame that we've had to cancel class because, friendly reminder, Wednesday night we are having the online midterm, and that's been completed. So at 6 p.m. on Wednesday, it's not long. It's 20 questions, multiple choice, open book. Should not be crazy difficult. If you've been coming to class, if you've been paying attention, should be easy. But another reminder is that after spring break, Storm of Steel is due. So remember when I said get on that and get started? This is sort of what I meant. Storm of Steel will be due the first Monday after spring break. So you have a little bit of time and you have the spring break to read it, but this is sort of like my final warning to start reading Storm of Steel and get on that and read fast, because when you finish reading it, you're going to have some thoughts, specifically when we talk about it in class. And I do really want to engage in that discussion with you guys about it. So get that done. Should be straightforward. Shouldn't be an issue. It's not a crazy long book either, so it's just a slog. Of course, the ambulance has to go by literally right now. Thank you. Sorry about that. But let's talk about today. So we left off, if you guys remember, with the revolutions of 1848, the collapse of the Napoleonic Empire, and that sort of subsequent wave after wave of revolution happening as a resistance, as a counter to the monarchist movements of the post-Napoleonic era. But this era, post-Napoleon, is characterized importantly by a much bigger and more important and more widespread phenomenon, and that is the Industrial Revolution. And the Industrial Revolution is truly a revolution in that there is a clear structure of society before and after the Industrial Revolution. And I would argue that the Industrial Revolution is in many ways a peaceful equivalent of what happens violently in America, where we talked about how the urban and the rural classes fight each other. And at the end of it, the rural classes don't just leave power, they are stripped fundamentally of any importance in society. And that's sort of what happens with the Industrial Revolution in Europe, especially in England. So here's what we're going to do. I have here the slideshow, and we are going to watch it. Start screen share. Okay, and present to everyone. Okay, so you should be able to see that now. What I want to say is that when we talk about the Industrial Revolution, we're not necessarily talking about the products being developed changing. Fundamentally speaking, the Industrial Revolution is not necessarily the creation of brand new products that will revolutionize life. What it is the rapid use of the technologies that we talked about and that we briefly mentioned, of those scientific processes that we talked about during the Enlightenment class, to create industrial production that rapidly revolutionizes pretty much all aspects of life. So what I mean to say is, think of a chair, right? Right now, if you need a chair, you don't go to a carpenter. You go to IKEA, or if you're cheap, Walmart, right? You go to get a mass-produced chair. But it's not that chairs didn't exist before the Industrial Revolution. They did. It's just that the way that chair is made today is fundamentally different than the way that chair was made before the Industrial Revolution. It's not handcrafted. It's not made by some artisan. It is made in a factory in large quantities. And this sort of concept, when applied to the rest of society, really changes how we interpret the Industrial Revolution. And before I move on, I know last time we had a lot of lag, so I am now directly plugged into my router. Let me know if it's better in the chat, and let me know if you are, being able to follow. I know last time that was a bit of a problem, so I hope that fixed it. But when we talk about the Industrial Revolution, we usually associate it with one country in particular. There's one country in particular that we associate with the Industrial Revolution, and that is England. England is the epicenter of the Industrial Revolution. It represents the core of where the Industrial Revolution happens. And we've sort of always taken that as a given. We've taken that for granted. We've taken that as a core assumption of, the Industrial Revolution is an English phenomenon. But we've never asked why. So what we're going to do now is we're going to look at a whole bunch of different interpretations for why the Industrial Revolution occurs in England. And the first one is the Marxist interpretation, which is, of all of them, the most straightforward. And it's the argument that England has its revolution a full 100 years before everybody else. And so obviously, you're going to see the effects of that revolution sooner. The English Civil War, the English Revolution, happens not in the 1700s, like with France and with America, or in the 1800s, in 1848, like with the rest of Europe. It happens all the way back in the 1600s, which means that they have a full 100-year head start over everybody else. And that means that they're going to hit the Industrial Revolution before everybody else, just, logically speaking. So of all of the interpretations, this one's the easiest one to understand. This is the simplest one. But there's also an economist understanding, which sort of harkens back to what we saw when we talked about Napoleon. If you guys remember, England was embargoed from Europe due to the continental system, and as a result was forced to expand into international markets, which means more money coming into England. More money equals more investment. So here's what I mean by that, right? If you're an English trader and you're in England, you don't say, well, this is fun, time to get a real job once you've been shut out from Europe. Instead, you look into the rest of the world. That's not really an option for you. So the answer is no, you don't just shut up shop. Instead, you look at the rest of the world. All of these places. The reason why England becomes a colonial empire in this period is partially because its merchants and its traders were sort of forced to go abroad seeking new markets. So they go into India, they go into China, they go into Indonesia and Malaysia, because that's really where the money is, right? There's more money in silk than there is in, say, wine. And when they bring that money into England, that money trickles into investment. But there's also a scientific understanding of it. England has the largest scientific tradition. Newton, Halley, James Watt, all of these scientists live and work in England, and they are either English themselves or they are attracted to England due to the opportunities that are there, thanks in part to the large university system at Oxford and at Cambridge. So it has this wealth of scientific discovery within its borders that it can call upon to just fuel this innovation, to create brand new products and brand new stuff. Also, there's a geographic understanding. There is one resource upon which the Industrial Revolution relies on more than anything, and that is coal. The Industrial Revolution runs on coal. Now, places like France and Italy and Germany, they may have more coal, but England's coal is more easily accessible. Remember, France, Italy, and Germany, these places have mountains that you have to dig underneath with advanced machinery. England is predominantly flat. And so if you're before the Industrial Revolution and your greatest piece of technology is a shovel, then digging under mountains is not an option for you. And so England has this head start because of its unique geography and having more accessible coal mines compared to the rest of Europe. There's also the geopolitical understanding of it. And this is the last one. And this one is also somewhat easy to understand. And it's this idea that England, not being part of the continent, never gets caught up in the wars that are fought on the continent. It always fights its wars on other people's land. That's really important. So like during the Napoleonic Wars, for example, the big battle, Waterloo, doesn't happen in England. It happens in Belgium. All of the battles of the Napoleonic Wars and prior do not happen on English soil. They happen in everywhere else, which means that after centuries of conflict in Europe, England leaves it with its infrastructure and its people and its resources, relatively speaking, untouched. Because if a war is fought in your backyard's getting messed up, regardless of who wins. England never has this problem because it's always, being this naval power, it's always fighting its wars somewhere else on other people's land. And this is sort of what we said, right? When Napoleon comes through Europe and sort of invades everywhere, it never reaches England. So these wars never making it to England means that England has a sort of infrastructure advantage over everyone else because everyone else's infrastructure is destroyed. It's not that England is particularly special in this regard. Now, all of these interpretations may be true. Maybe none of them are true. But the fact of the matter is, England reaches the Industrial Revolution before any other country in Europe. And remember what we said, these being our four classes, the urban rich over here, the urban poor, the rural rich, and the rural poor. These classes, especially these two classes, the rural classes, oh, I did not mean to do that, essentially cease to exist. The nobility becomes an urban class to the same level as the bourgeoisie is in the cities. And the peasantry, well, they are increasingly displaced by advanced forms of harvesting. Techniques that are used in the Industrial Revolution to dramatically increase crop yields. And what this means is, remember in the second class when we talked about how the potato displaced so many people from the fields and into the cities? Well, now it's that, but exponentially larger, because there's no reason for these peasants to stay in the fields anymore. And so they leave because what's the point? And so they move into the cities. London, Manchester, Newcastle, Liverpool, the big cities of the Industrial Revolution explode in this period in size. Now, if you guys will remember, the last economic theory that we left on, Adam Smith, made the argument that if the government would just stay out of it, stay out of governmental affairs, that we would see, we summarized it as bigger, better, cheaper smartphones for everyone. This concept being that the free market would deliver better outcomes than we can ever foresee. Now, it's been about 100 years of free liberalism. So let's check in and see how this has worked out for people. This is a picture of where you live. This is the city that you live in. This is your neighborhood. This is your apartment. It's one room and you all sleep in it. This is the street that you live on. This is where you work. Men and women, very egalitarian. So egalitarian, in fact, that your kids work here too, boys and girls. This is the air that you breathe. This is what you eat. What happened? That's the core question, right? Because the promise of liberalism was that if the government just got out of your way, that we would see bigger, better, cheaper smartphones for everyone. That was the promise. That was what the promise of liberalism was. And yet, if you look at your life, that's not the case, is it? Your life seems to be pretty miserable. If you're at the bottom of the food chain in the Industrial Revolution, your life is not great. And that may be an understatement. And this has to do, in part, with the industrial pricing model. So I give here an example of the objectively superior flavor of Doritos. Sorry to all of you Cool Ranch fans, but this was the best flavor. Let's say this cost about $1 in stores, but that price of $1 is not made up. It's the result and calculated price of a series of considerations. 30 cents goes to overhead. You know, the corn, the flavoring, the cost of packaging, shipping, all of the things that it cost me to put this bag of Doritos together. 50 cents of that per bag, let's say, goes to the labor. You have to pay someone to physically assemble those materials and create a product out of it. And 20 cents are profit. What's in it for me? All right? 30, 50, 20. So far, so good. All right, here we have a competitively priced bag of chips. What happens if player 2 enters the game at a lower price, forcing you to compete? Well, which one of these can you cut? So you can't cut your overhead because your overhead is going to cost what it costs. Keep in mind, the people selling you the corn and the flavoring and the plastic and the shipping services have the same problem of you that you have, just one level down. And your profit, you're not going to cut your profit. What are you, crazy? So the only thing that you can cut in order to produce the cheapest product available is your labor costs. Is your labor costs. And so you're going to invest in, say, machines that are going to cut out labor as much as possible. You're going to create things like the production line, in which instead of having one person making the bag of chips from start to finish. Instead, you have one person, say, kneading the dough, one person operating the fryer, one person, sealing the bags. And the reason for that is that when you do that, when you do that sort of thing, you make the job increasingly easier to do. And remember what we said about minimum wage jobs. Minimum wage jobs pay minimum wage because everyone can do them, because anyone can do them. That's why they pay minimum wage. But of course, this is the Industrial Revolution. There is no minimum wage. Minimum wage is what the market says is the minimum wage, and it's what I'm willing to pay you for your work. And keep in mind that this means you can use things like, say, machinery. You can use things like child labor. Keep in mind, kids don't need to eat as much, so you can pay them a little less. You use large quantities in bulk to lower your costs. Anything you need to do to make that product as cheap as possible. Bear in mind that in the Industrial Revolution, minimum wage is not the amount of money that you can live on. Minimum wage is the smallest amount of money that I can pay you for you to eat today and then run out of money. Why? So that you have to come back tomorrow. And this is the world that Karl Marx is reacting to. And this is sort of what I mean when we talk about Marx, is the world that Marx is reacting to is a world that is A, objectively terrible, and B, a world that arguably, to some extent, does not exist anymore, at least not to the level that it did there. So what I mean to say is, let me stop this real quick. Okay, perfect. All right. So what I mean to say is, when Marx talks about, the bourgeoisie oppressing the working class, when Marx talks about working conditions being terrible, about seizing the means of production, what he's talking about and what he's criticizing is a world that by any metric is not a good one, is not a world that you would want to be at the bottom of the food chain in. It's just objectively not. Being a working class family in the Victorian era is kind of horrible, is kind of bad. And so when Marx is viewing this and he's criticizing this, he sort of looks at it and tries to diagnose the problems with capitalism. And he does it in a book. Here it is, the Manifesto. Of course I own a copy of the Manifesto. I'm not helping my case that I'm not a secret socialist. I'm not. But the Manifesto, when you look at it, first thing you'll notice is that it's small. It is physically small. It's a pamphlet, really. And you guys had to read it for today. You will see that it is written in plain English. It's not written like, say, Smith or Hobbes were, in sort of this higher version of English that is difficult and obtuse. He's writing in a way that is accessible, because the target audience for this sort of book is the factory worker on the production line. This book is designed to be small enough to smuggle into a factory, to read, and then pass along the line to somebody else. And this is sort of when we talk about the rise of the socialist movement and social labor, understand that the things that they're fighting for, unionization, the weekend, public education, workers' compensation, the 8-hour workday, things that we sort of take for granted now, were radical ideas at the time. They were, concepts that did not exist at the time. At the time, it was government shouldn't get involved, let the market run everything, and survival of the fittest in economics. And this sort of leads to, on a side note, some pretty horrible social Darwinian ideas about, oh, the poor are bad, and therefore they deserve to be poor, or the poor are stupid, therefore they deserve to be poor. Things like that. And these things are not necessarily aspects of Marxism that get talked a lot about today. And I don't mean to say that this is the ideology that you should follow. That is not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that at the time, the workers that were listening and following and reading this and listening to Marx in London, at the time Marx lived in London, go around and give speeches, liked what Marx was selling. So Marx envisions a future in which workers own the means of production, which Marx often calls property, which is why, parentheses, the idea that Marx wants to take all your stuff comes from. It's a bit of a misreading of maybe intentional, maybe not, of what he's saying. What he's saying is basically, if you're working in a factory and you're, busting your behind, trying to produce this stuff and seeing very little as a result, while owner of the factory gets filthy rich while not doing anything, the better alternative for society would be for the workers who work in that factory to own that factory, to be owned by the union. This is sort of the most basic premise behind Marxism. I'm not saying that that's a good idea. I'm just saying that that's his idea. And that the workers who were living objectively crappy lives kind of like that. There's another book that I didn't assign. Keep in mind what I'm saying. This was a book too depressing for this class. So understand what I'm saying there. But by it's called The Jungle by Upton Sinclair. Upton Sinclair, by the way, who died just around the corner in Bound Brook, New Jersey. So not that far away from us. Upton Sinclair writes the story of working class immigrants working in the meatpacking district of New York City, back when the meatpacking district was exactly what its name implied it was doing. It was basically where they made canned meat, Spam. Keep in mind that as workers' wages went down, you needed to produce cheaper and cheaper food for them to eat, which meant corned beef and Spam. Not to knock Spam. I hear Hawaiians love it, but it's not the most expensive food, and it's not the best food for you. And the story that Upton Sinclair describes in The Jungle is so horrific. It is so awful, the working conditions, the health conditions in this factory, that it would lead to the creation of what would become the Food and Drug Administration. So think about how influential this book is. And the story is of two Polish immigrants. And I'm not to spoil the book, but they're working in this meatpacking district, and there's this big machine that's churning up, whatever meat you throw in there. It doesn't really matter. But of course, this is pre-sanitation, pre-sanitized, clean factory. So what is often found in factories that produce food and that are not particularly clean? What kind of vermin, specifically in New York City, where the subway is? I'm talking, of course, about pizza rats, right? And so rats would climb up into the machine and eat all the stuff and leave whatever they were done with. You know what I'm talking about? Rat poop in the machine. But you come in the next morning and you got to start the machine up again. You're going to wait for the rats to get out? No, you start it up with all the rats in it. Delicious. There is a particular scene in the book where someone gets their hand caught in the machine and they don't stop it. And so this guy's hand after all, once it's in there, you can't unblend it. We're talking horrific stuff. This is why this book was too much for this class, maybe. There is also some pretty bad instances of sexual violence with the foreman, basically threatening to tell their employer that they're like sleeping on the job and slacking unless the wife sleeps with them. Really bad stuff. This is the world that the working class in the Industrial Revolution is trying to escape. And so you can understand, you don't have to agree with Marxism. You don't. I don't. But you can understand why someone in that situation will look at what Marx is selling and say, yeah, I like that. That makes a lot of sense to me. Tell me more. And that's sort of what happens. And that's sort of where we end up with Marxism. So I have two videos I want to show, and this is an experiment. If it doesn't work, then I'm just going to give you the links and you're going to watch it for next time. But I did want to screen share. Let me know in the chat if you guys can hear this. Present to everyone. All right. So if I click play, let me know in the chat if you guys can hear this. All right. Okay, so I'm hearing in the chat that you guys can't hear these videos. Okay, so here's then what I'm gonna do. I am going to, I think I sent you Humans Need Not Apply beforehand, and Political Theory Karl Marx is in the Canvas. So what we're gonna do is you're gonna watch both of these for Wednesday, and very briefly on Wednesday, we're gonna go over them in class. And we're going to discuss them because there is a lot about Marxism that I'm not particularly an expert on, but that the videos explain very well. And so I'm going to let the video do that part of explanation. And we're going to, sort of comment on it and discuss it and see how it impacts us in our personal lives. But the Humans Need Not Apply video is more of a look to the future than a look to the past. I think part of the job of history is to be able to do that. So watch them both, and then we're going to discuss on Wednesday. All right? If you have any questions, you email them to me. Again, reminders, Wednesday, the online midterm. After spring break Monday, Storm of Steel is due. The reaction paper is due that night. So get that book completed by then. No extensions. You don't get an extension because I told you September 1st, like when we first met, hey, start with the reading. So I don't want to hear it. And on that note, I think we'll call it a day. Enjoy the rest of your day, guys. Bye-bye.